John, you came under the supervision of Peter Laslett. Tell me something about Peter.
Peter was a very nice person to work with, and he was he conveyed many of his very many enthusiasms very effectively to the people he was teaching. And he liked you to go along and sit with him and admire his books and listen to.
Of which he had many, John Locke.
He had lots of wonderful 17th century books. And he was at that point in time, I mean, obviously he was starting off to do work mostly on the history of population, and he was very enthusiastic about that. But he hadn't lost the enthusiasm he'd had for his researches on Locke, and for him those researches really consisted of a sort of lengthy adventure story. I mean, they had sort of intellectual pretensions too, but the central thread, red line running through the middle of them, was the story of an intellectual adventure, which was also often a social adventure. I mean, it sort of overlapped a bit with the Aspern papers, but it was he wanted very much to convey and pass on to the people he was teaching a sort of zest for the trail, for following the trail, and he wanted to relive, I mean, the excitements of his own chase.
This was finding Locke's library.
Well, that was one of the high points, recited probably not more than 40 or 50 times, hearing at varying lengths. But that was an example of many others, of just a big, grand, and consequential example of many others. And he was always very interested in relations with persons and how those had come out in relation to following the trail. And that's why the stories were good stories on the whole. So there were lots of stories about Paul Mellon, who'd been a very important figure from his point of view, and on whom he had quite a lot of practical influence. I mean, he persuaded to buy a very large chunk of what left behind that was on the market at one point, and several different points, and transported off to the Bodleian eventually. So that side of working with him, I'm sure it had counterparts with other historians. I think maybe Jack Plum, perhaps, when he was trying to encourage his graduate students to insinuate themselves into the affections of noble families who would have the papers they'd require. I mean, may have approached the matter in a rather similar spirit, but and actually they had more in common temperamentally in that respect than you'd guess, really, because they were pretty unlike each other in most other respects. But they both prided themselves on the capacity to get other people to do what they wanted, and they could both turn that capacity, as it were, in retrospect, into really good stories indeed. I mean, Peter had continuing intellectual interests, which, I mean, varied in interest from my point of view, and some of them I was very interested in myself, and some of them I really wasn't interested in at all. And I mean, he did operate on a very broad front. I mean, his intellectual interests were very diverse, really. And I suppose he conveyed, I mean, the aspect of working with him which made it very much an apprenticeship was that he conveyed a sense of how you did the work and what it was like to do the work. I mean, he conveyed a sort of life world sense of what it was, and he attempted to induct you into that life world, and that involved going into Avalanche and Trinity and being introduced introduced to great figures from the intellectual history of the 20th century, with whom you might not immediately have, much in the way of small talk comfortably in common. Piero Sraffa and E.H. Carr and so on. But it was quite exciting, and the people he had come to his sort of graduate seminar, slightly too formal a description of what it was, a group of graduate students meeting to discuss with these visiting grandees in his room. They were diverse, and some of them were very impressive people, some were less impressive. But, he certainly suggested opening horizons. He suggested you could pursue your own intellectual interests, and you could have a very good time, and you could travel the world, and the horizons reached a very long way out, and that was all very nice. He talked about his different current intellectual enthusiasms with great zest, and he listened to what you had to say. Not for a very large proportion of the time, but for enough of the time to be sort of gratifying and encouraging. And on the whole, he was enthusiastic about what his students had to say. So I don't know if he had any very, very, very loquacious students with no brains at all. But anyway, he was always very supportive in that respect as a supervisor. He was pretty inattentive in some sort of technical didactic sense. He didn't necessarily think terribly hard about arguments that you'd written down, and he didn't necessarily read your work at just the right point in time or anything like that. So he lived in a sort of whirl of chaos, as he did himself. So the chaos, that was part of all the agreeable side, but it wasn't obviously completely satisfactory from a transactional, educational point of view. But he was very. I didn't myself think that in relation to some of his intellectual interests, he really understood matters very deeply and sort of steadily, but he was extraordinarily good on Locke. It wasn't just that he'd done some rather dashing archival research and established, or more or less established, some sort of striking historical fact which people were previously unaware of about Locke. I think it was also that he really did have a very good feel for what Locke was like, and what sorts of things he was actually preoccupied with. And I think hermeneutically he was very skilled really with Locke, and that made him a very nice person to talk about Locke with. The best bits from my point of view of working with him were definitely the bits in which I was working sort of frontally on Locke, because there, he was extremely instructive and very, very helpful. On what was initially supposed to be my PhD, he was more sporadically informed and therefore considerably less helpful. And I suppose, one of the things which was nice about working with him is that he treated his pupils as though they were more or less the same age as him. And it didn't actually take very long as his pupil before you came to the conclusion that in certain respects he was more or less right in so doing. Not in that they were all sort of intellectually as far advanced in their explorations as he was, but in the sense that he was a very sort of incontinent person. He wasn't perfectly in control of anything. And what made him very suggestive and very exciting to talk about things with was, in a sense, the sort of impulsiveness and immediacy of his responses. I think it probably is right to say that he actually got really further with Locke before he signed off than he did probably with anything else that he did intellectually in his life. So in a way that was the peak of his capabilities, and it was very, very fully present really if you were working with him. And I think I must definitely have enjoyed working with him much more than Quentin did, for example. I think Quentin always operated very much in his own terms, and those terms can't have overlapped very much with Peter's in some respects. And I think Quentin was more sort of deeply impatient with the chaos, really. I think he didn't... I really rather liked the chaos, except when it imposed direct costs on me at a particular point. I mean, I found it charming. He was a very charming person, Peter, when he was trying to be. And he, with his graduate students, he almost always was trying to be. Now, I'm not always trying to be charming with my graduate students, quite apart from the question of capability. And actually, I think most people aren't consistently trying to be charming with their graduate students. They have other things to do with them for some of the time anyway. But Peter, in a way, almost never had anything more urgent to do with his graduate students than to be charming with them. And so he sort of caught you up in a common spiral of, slightly frivolous enjoyment, which at the same time was very, very instructive, in retrospect. It showed you a great deal. It was a very un-Puritan bit of education, really. But it was very educative, and it certainly made me like him very much indeed. And I was always very fond of him from a few weeks into starting to work with him as a graduate student. And I didn't know him at all before. I went to a few of his lectures, which were of very merit beforehand, but I didn't know him at all. So it could have been not a nice experience, but it was a very nice experience. I'm very grateful for it.
Yes, well, it all accords with what Sarah, my wife, and I feel about him too. We miss him very much. Every time we go past Clarkson Road, our faces fall and we say, "Oh, Peter, where is he now?" Coming back to King's, you came back and became a teaching fellow and director of studies. It was just before I came. Are there any people in King's who would be nice to talk about? I think Edmund was probably provost when you came, was he, or was it the end of Noel?
It was Noel who imported me, but Edmund who was sort of on the throne when I arrived. I didn't know Edmund well, but I liked Edmund very much too. Actually Edmund was terrible to start off with. There was about 6 months of complete chaos when he was hopelessly out of control and therefore in an absolutely filthy temper. And the college couldn't cope with such a very large, very angry man, especially in that role. So there was a bad patch, and very few people would stand up to him because they were so frightened by the bad temper. British aren't very good in the face of bad temper. I disapproved of some things that he did at that point quite a lot, but that was quite a brief interlude in retrospect, he became an extraordinarily good provost, I think. There's no doubt about it at all. He became a convincing intellectual leader of an institution that is incredibly supercilious about the idea of being led intellectually. But he actually, as a sort of social role, he brought it off completely, I think. And he made it an exciting place to be in. Noel conveyed a tremendous sense of sort of occasion and stage presence and all the rest of it. But that looked, to me anyway, sort of pretty illusory. mean, there were bits of what actually had happened in the college under him, which perhaps fitted the bill, but his sense of occasion and my sense of occasion hardly overlapped at all. So I thought it was sort of empty and bombastic. I mean, the picture of the college as a sort of grand intellectual stage at that point, which he was incessantly purveying. But it sort of began to become, I mean, simply true for me under Edmund's provostship, and I think, I mean, in some ways, the sequence from Edmund to Bernard was distinctive, because Bernard was so sort of dashingly, publicly clever whenever he felt like it, that he, I mean, in a way, you had to resist him not to, I think, succumb to that. But I mean, with Edmund, it was more impulsive, and in some respects, I mean, it was sort of existentially rather denser than it was with Bernard. And I think Edmund made the college into a sort of rather odd sort of social whole in a way that Bernard certainly didn't. I mean, Bernard was much more detached and individualist, and you know, his own person, irrespective of whether or not he happened to be provost at the time. But Edmund, in a way, sort of became provost, and I thought he did it wonderfully, really, in retrospect. This figure, if you like, initially, I must say, as I said, I very much disapproved, because he behaved so disgracefully, really, for a bit. I came to be very fond of too.
Well, those were the glory days when I, as I remember them, when I first came to the fellowship electors, when you ran a competition, and then I came as a research fellow, and the research electors were a very star-studded group, weren't they, at that time, with Sydney and later Martin Rees and so on and so on. But which of the fellows have really become friends, or you would like to talk about it at all? I mean, one could go through the list, but...
well, there are people I've been very involved with because of their role in the college as an institution, I suppose, and some of them are nothing at all to do with my subject, however you construe it. I mean, Martin Highland, for example, I've become very fond of Martin, and we've sort of fought in a lot of different campaigns together, almost invariably unavailingly, but I mean, I wouldn't regret any of the campaigns, and I've certainly come to think very well and to feel very warmly about him in that context. There are a small number of people who take college in a way sort of perhaps slightly ludicrously seriously, and have exaggerated the high goals for it, or requirements of it, fantasies of it, and I mean, he's certainly been one of the people in my time here of whom that's been true. And I think it is definitely true that the college, as of now, I mean, is a somewhat depleted version of what it was in the glory days. And I think it is true that you can understand the process of depletion in a sort of causal way, I mean, fairly coherently. So there was a real battle going on over that period of time, but whether or not people who reigned on the different sides had very good judgments about what it would be a good idea to do or a bad idea to do. Everyone's judgment is fairly erratic, and most of these matters are imponderable at the time in question. People get very angry with each other and so on. So, I mean, it's probably a messy story if we go over it with any care. But I would say that from that, across that period of time, I mean, Martin Howland is one of the people I felt closest to, really. I mean, there are people I'm close to because of the overlap with my own work in different ways. Probably Istvan Hunt is the person I'm closest to from that point of view, because like you, he came to King's as a senior research fellow and to work on a project in the research centre, which, as it happens, was on loosely speaking the Scottish Enlightenment. Why that's the basis of modern wisdom about the world, and so far as there is any such thing. And I mean, he came from quite a long way away, and a very distinctive sort of political experience. His father was a minister in the communist government in Hungary, and he came as a sort of intellectually compulsive anti-Marxist, and he came, in a sense, to reassert the Scottish Enlightenment against the errors of what came later, really, downstream. And I've learnt a great deal from him in relation to many things that I'm interested in. And as a personal relation, I mean, it's had its ups and downs, but I mean, intellectually, it's been extraordinarily instructive for me. I mean, I've learned an enormous amount from it. Probably, in a sense, professionally, I've learned more from him than I have from anyone else in the last 25 years or so. 30 years or so. I suppose it's important that my principal interests are in what's been happening to the world politically, and why it's been happening to the world politically, and what it means. Cambridge isn't a terrifically good place to think about those questions, because there aren't very many people around here with a lot of expertise in relation to the very large number of different bits of the potential answer to them. And I mean, this fund has turned out to be more of a resource in relation to trying to think systematically about those questions than anyone else has here over that period of time. But I mean, there are lots of other things which Cambridge is very wonderful for, and some of those are serviceable. I've had lots of nice relationships with people about different areas of intellectual interest, but they haven't sort of made as deep an indentation in my life, probably, as this firm has. And in relation to the college, as I say, I don't really think anybody else probably has been sort of consistently imaginatively in sympathy with me, or I was consistently imaginative in sympathy with about the college as Martin. I mean, I've had there were lots of things I've agreed, obviously, with lots of people, but there are people I've been very glad to be a fellow alongside in many different ways over that period of time. I could make a long list. Martin Rees, Carrie
Humphrey.
Yes. Pete de Boller, I mean, very assorted people. But I mean, none of those people really have actually had a big effect on the way in which I think about things. And I wouldn't say any of them had I wouldn't say I in a sense, thought and felt about college in the same sort of way as any of them over a long period of time, really. I mean, there's something which is potentially of interest, I think, about the the sort of tie you have to a college, if, like me, you've come to it very much by accident, and it's established the practical framework in which you could begin to build an adult life. And I was a feudal dependent, in a sense, of the college for quite a long time, in a way that most university teachers are, sort of bourgeois dependents of bits of quite large institutions that are not very sort of domestic kind, which have a structure that comes from partly from the government and partly from the sort of proliferating requirements of the quest for knowledge and so on. But I mean, a college is a very much more domestic sort of site than that. If it's your primary relation to a university city, you have a different sense of belonging in the city than you have if you're university teaching officer that comes from somewhere else and draws a proper salary on a proper normal basis, I mean, like any other member of the sort of professionalised bureaucratic workforce. I think it's both more menial and more intimate, the relationship you have to a college, and as the roles change over time, I mean, the sense of the menial side of it drops away a bit, but the sort of personal tie side of it doesn't drop away really, and that's very involving. I mean, it's meant that King's has consumed a lot more of my emotion and probably quite a lot more of my time than there was any instrumentally good reason for it to do so. And I mean, certainly my wife thinks that that's an occasion for regret, but I can't pretend I feel it's an occasion for regret myself.
And that is partly referring to when you came as a NUTO, as they call them now, non-university teaching officer for some years, and then you got assistant lectureship in SBS, is that right? And then you became a lecturer.
Lectureship in SBS.
Lectureship, and then you didn't become a reader, you went straight to a
No, I became a reader about 5 years after that. Oh. Horror of the history faculty.
And then you became professor.
And then I became professor later, yes.
In passing, you said something about Cambridge is a very good place for many things, and you mentioned that meeting people who weren't necessarily in your subject. Are there other things about the university which you feel, because I'm interested in what ways it contributes to our intellectual creativity and so on, are there other ways in which you think it's a good university to be in?
I think there are very simple and very drastically important respects in which it's good to be in. It is very good to teach in a place in which you can be certain that they're constantly going to be arriving very, very clever 18-year-olds. I mean, that is a terrific benefit if you want to live an intellectual life. It's sort of constant rejuvenation process to sound completely successful, but then nothing would be. But insofar as anything could be, probably that's the best possibility. And of course it is also, in some respects, a very parochial place in all sorts of ways, but in some respects also extremely cosmopolitan, in the sense that it's that people come to it from all over the world constantly, and come in some sense in hope. I think that has been very important for me. I mean, it's a very easy place in which to maintain intellectual friendships with people right across the world, and quite an easy place in which to form intellectual friendships with people from a very long way away. And I would say it was as propitious from those points of view as it is for forming intellectual friendships across disciplines inside a university. I think it is a very, very big thing that if you are a fellow of a college for decades, I've been a fellow of this college for more than 40 years now, you're just guaranteed to have, unless you have no friends at all, you're guaranteed to have friends who are in disciplines a very long way away from your own. And that is a very good thing in the modern academic world, or just the modern world. I mean, it's very enabling, that, I think. And if you contrast it with the experience of teaching in a not very optimistic provincial university in this country now, you can see that it's really hard for people to have, it's quite hard for people to have an interesting intellectual life, really, on the basis of their employment. I mean, some people will have such a life unstoppably wherever they are, but if you're ordinarily dependent in that respect, I mean, it makes an enormous difference if, in fact, you're constantly talking to people who really do know about completely different things and will see aspects of the world and present themselves to you in a really different way from you, because they simply know about different relevant considerations. And I think it's very, very good to be, the contrast between being a fellow of a college in Oxford or Cambridge and a member of a disciplinary department in most British universities is a tremendous contrast in opportunity. And I'm very conscious of that. I mean, that's made a huge difference.
I mean, you've spent some time in America. Have you ever been tempted to leave Cambridge and go to America? You must have had offers, or even Japan.
I did consider going, in a sense, in bad temper at a certain point under Mrs. Thatcher, I had a very, very nice time when I was in America in the mid-1960s, on the Harkness at Harvard, and sort of wandering around the United States. I like going back to America usually quite a lot, and I've taught in several other American universities. I've taught at Yale, and I'm going back to teach there briefly in the near future, and I've taught at Tulane, which is a very weird institution because of the extraordinary city, and and I've taught in the University of Minnesota for a bit, and I quite like being in different bits of America, but I would be more dismayed at the thought of going there and staying there now than I would have been when I first went there, because in some respects, I mean, the America I first went to was at its most sort of Europe-friendly and social democracy-friendly in its entire history, and it's moved back, from my point of view, a very long way, and it's actually a very long way from that since, and I find it very much less attractive now. I find it politically offensive, really, in ways that what was offensive about it in the mid-1960s, in a sense, was clearly, as it were, simply a consequence of the history it had had, and in that sense was not unequivocally, at that point in time, its fault, it was its fate. But I feel that since then, I mean, it's really regressed as a civilization in important respects. I mean, it's chosen harsher and, in some respects, I think, stupider sort of social and economic shape. And it's adopted a series of policies in relation to the rest of the world, which I very strongly disapprove in many respects. And I think it's a less desirable aspect of the world, and of course it's a very large and consequential aspect of the world, so the shift, I mean, matters tremendously to lots of other people, most other people actually, in some respects. So I wouldn't really like to go there. I mean, if you think of moving there as a sort of quasi-civic transition, the idea of shifting civically towards the United States, it would be very unattractive.
We've talked somewhat of the college. But you've been involved also quite centrally in the faculty of social and political sciences, chairman and so on. That's had a not uniformly easy time. I mean, I came when John Barnes was head of something which wasn't really a faculty, but then you had Anthony Giddens and so on. Well, Tony Giddens is someone you might have some views about.
I have lots of views about Tony, yes. He was a terrible colleague, and he can be a very nice companion. He's a very, very clever, very fluent person, and he has extraordinary energy. And the fact that those characteristics were present in someone who was a terrible colleague really wrecked about 7 or 8 years of my life. So I was very, very hostile to him for a lot of that time. I mean, not sort of completely in the round ever, because the companion charm came through whenever he wanted it to. And if
was this ideologically, or?
It was actually, I would say, educationally. I mean, ideologically, we're not all that far apart. I mean, I think many of his sort of enunciated ideological views are pretty fatuous, but they're not sort of intensely objectionable. I mean, they're not sort of wildly and deeply wrong. I mean, they're just sort of vague and vapid, I think. So it's not. I don't have a deep problem with them. I just have a problem taking them entirely seriously. But I mean, we were very often in conflict about what to do about the social and political sciences faculty, and almost invariably in conflict about what to do about the presence of politics in that faculty. And of course we were both sort of rats in too small a cage, really. We were both stuck with a setting in which university, a grand research university, had set up our subjects on such a small scale that they really couldn't be done satisfactorily, and we were both constantly therefore having to decide what to do about that. And in practice, I mean, that largely translated into disagreements about who most urgently needed another job. And of course, nobody was that most presentable in relation to that sort of topic disagreement. But I mean, what I found very difficult with Tony, and in that setting, and mattered a great deal in that setting, in ways it probably didn't when he was running LSE, was that he would never consider a question of that kind on the basis of some articulated and accountable view of what was educationally needed. I mean, he just didn't deal in those categories at all. He dealt with it entirely as a sort of positional game of appropriation. And I couldn't really deal with that. I mean, I didn't, it offended me, and also it exhausted me. And in retrospect, the exhaustion seems much more important than the offence, and that's all sort of energy gone. But
another person who, someone else you've worked with is Sandy Robertson. You wrote a book with Sandy. How did that happen?
Yes, well, that was a real fluke, but it was a very nice fluke from my point of view, and I don't think it really did have Sandy much harm. I mean, he was, I mean, that happened, it goes back to the college, I mean, how it happened. It happened because I was very keen to go and look at a part of the post-colonial world reasonably carefully. I thought that I wanted to do political theory on what was happening now, and I thought that political theory somehow should think about categories which, I mean, unless they're very deep and imaginative people, should think about categories that are relatively novel and sort of reasonably extensively instantiated, because that will give them at least some chance of seeing something which other people haven't already seen, which is really there. And I thought post-colonial states, there are lots of post-colonial states, there weren't any post-colonial, almost no post-colonial states in 1944. There were lots and lots of post-colonial states by the late 1960s, and I thought, and the American political science and sort of political sociology obviously didn't have a clue really about them at that point. I mean, we were talking complete nonsense about them. And I thought this is something that is a very important bit of world politics, and it's not being well understood. And I must get myself to one of these places and take a proper look at it, and then I'll be able to think in a slightly more consecutive and potentially helpful way about it. And, but I couldn't see how I could without losing my sort of feudal status, I mean employment. And what happened providentially was that the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Ghana, a sort of former classics PhD student of the college, came to the college and said that any fellow of the college could come and teach at his university for a year whenever they felt like it, hoping that sort of floods of molecular biologists and mathematicians and so on would stream off in that direction. But of course none of those actually wanted to. And I very, very much wanted to go somewhere, I mean, of which Ghana was an example, somewhere which was definitely a post-colonial state, and it was an interesting time to go to Ghana from that point of view, because it was under the first post-Nkrumah government, and Nkrumah sort of pioneered post-colonial states in Africa, so it would be a big historical item. It was a military and police regime, so it wasn't going to last for very long at that point. And its advertisement for itself was its very temporary character. And I thought this would be a really good place to go to, and furthermore I can go there without getting sacked, so I should do so. So I did. And about 3 or 4 months, I suppose, before I went, I mean, I learned that, possibly it was Jack Goody who told me, I don't remember, but I learned that there was a postdoctoral student in Cambridge, Sandy Robertson, who was going to work in Ghana for a couple of years. I mean, I've got the date slightly wrong, but anyway, for about that period of time, on a project on Ghanaian local government. And Jack suggested that perhaps he and I might cooperate in some way in this research, and I met him, and we agreed that we would indeed cooperate, and I said that what I was interested in really was understanding what's happening politically now. And obviously it would be very special to have an opportunity to have some sort of real access to that, somewhere, some distance away from the capital. I said in return I would do what was required in the Public Record Office, and maybe the Ghana National Archives in Accra, to try to fathom what was happening on the political scene in relation to this place from the centre, and we would put together, I mean, what we learned from these 2 exercises and see how much sense we could make out of it. And I mean, essentially what happened practically was that Sandy went and worked there in the forest about 250 miles from Accra for quite a long time, and I taught in the university, and in the vacations I went to see him in this setting, and he sort of showed me around and established various relations with people, and then when he went back again, which was I suppose about 4 or 5 months before I went back to Cambridge, he simply handed over to me his habitat in full working order, which was a terrific help practically. And so I did. I spent several months, consecutively working there at the end. And in between I sort of went up and down a great deal while he was still there and indeed after he'd gone, to try and get some sense of what was going on at the time in this area. And he was working on local government and therefore on the relationship between sort of modern local government institutions and chieftaincy, which was very intricate and partly fraught and partly cooperative. And when he came back again, he was very meticulous and orderly, sadly. Anyway, in sort of record keeping. And I've never been that. But I did do a lot of work, which was for that really, and as much, certainly at least as much, it was for that as was for, in any direct sense, for the reason that I'd initially gone there. And when I came back, and he was working away on his material, we talked about whether we actually could write a book together, and we decided that actually it might work quite well to write something together. He was a very good person to cooperate with, very unlike me, in that he could take decisions and stick to the decisions that he'd taken and implement them effectively. And so he was a very sort of anchoring person to work with. I had just about, I suppose I had about 5 months or so from the time that I actually got the, 5 or 6 months from the time I actually got the university job, SPS, before I had to start teaching. Between the time I knew I'd got it and the time I actually had to start teaching. In that time, I had enough time to write my half of the book. It's a big book, by my standards anyway. My bit of it is longer than any other book I've written. And we wrote roughly half each, I think, in the end. It's the sort of book which it's not easy to explain what genre it belongs to, because it doesn't particularly belong to any pre-established genre, and it didn't create a genre, so you have to explain what on earth you think it is. But it did give, in a way, a picture of what had happened to one bit of Africa from before colonial power was established, through colonial rule and out the other end, as a sort of single interpretative structure. And at that point, that was an unusual thing to do in African studies. I think lots of people try to do that now, but people weren't really trying to do that then. And the people who, neither historians nor political scientists, nor actually even anthropologists were trying to do exactly that. And I mostly, when I was working on African politics, I spent much more time and intellectually speaking, socialising with anthropologists than I did with any other discipline, because they were on the whole more help. But that book certainly isn't in any straightforward sense a work of anthropology. You can see that half of it's written by someone who has been an anthropologist, but I don't think you would say exactly it's a piece of anthropology. And it certainly isn't exactly a piece of history, and it even more certainly isn't a piece of political science, whatever that is. But it is an attempt to do something which, in a way, people might actually want done. I have a sort of hunch, I suppose, still, that if Ghanaians from the right bit of the country wanted to get some sense of what had happened, which was for essentially to be text-derived, I mean, they might as well start there as start anywhere else at all, really. I mean, I think it was quite a success in its own rather odd terms. And, I mean, Sandy went on to do quite a number of different sorts of things subsequently, and he, I mean, I think his inclination was to do things which were both a bit more theoretical than that, perhaps quite a lot more theoretical than it, and a bit more sort of practical in implication than that. And actually, it isn't at all a theoretical book, and it doesn't have any practical implications. But except, you know, for God's sake, be careful what you do if you're trying to reinvent the institutional apparatus of a society in real time.
Turning back to your own work, I mean, recently you've published one or more books on democracy. Has it a future, or is there anything you feel you'd like to say about that theme in your work on democracy?
Well, I've been in a way trying to think about politics the whole way through, in terms of a sort of balancing between sort of potentially delusory hope and the recognition of what actually does happen in politics and why it does. I mean, some sort of effort to face up to political causality. And I became interested in democracy for two rather different reasons, one of which goes back to Moses Finley and the other of which goes back to Ghana, essentially. In the case of Moses, I mean, Moses just, one of the things that Moses taught was how to think about Athenian democracy and how to think about today through thinking about Athenian democracy. I mean, he just did that and put it exactly like that from the educational presentation, but that's what he was doing. And that instruction went home very far, and it's made the whole way through my career sort of teaching about politics, I've had some rather confident and relatively, in relation to other contemporaries, I mean independent intuitions about democracy as a subject. And I've been, I mean, recurrently very interested in it, and I, initially not for any sort of very peremptory reason, but I've come back to it a number of times, and I got very interested in it in one very important respect, which is still very pertinent indeed today, when I was working in Ghana, because I was trying to understand what was so toxic about the character of a post-colonial state and about what the prospects were for sort of detoxifying it. And obviously democracy is the current, as it were, practical formula for at least attempting that task. And obviously there are some special difficulties about implementing democracy successfully in African countries. I mean, I think that is on record inductively now. And I was thinking as hard as I could about that. I mean, through the 1970s and into the early 1980s, and I sort of stopped that essentially because I didn't go on going back to Ghana, and I didn't go on going back to Ghana because it had been sort of wrecked by the military criminals who hijacked it at one point. I came back to thinking about democracy, I mean, much more casually anyway, and when I was trying to see how to join up what I thought I had learnt about democracy in the ancient world from Moses to what had happened to the category. across the rest of history, and I just put together a sort of composite work of other people's efforts, I mean, about what actually had happened. But the point of doing so was to try to ask what connection, if any, there is between what happened in Athens and what's happening now. And I might have sort of given up at that point. I wouldn't necessarily have gone back to it, because most of what I've been thinking about in relation to other places, I mean, hasn't really been essentially about democracy until quite recently. But I was pulled back to it really by the judgment that, that there was some that democracy was a much more consequential, orientating category in politics in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that what is politically problematic about it, which in a sense always was politically problematic about it, is therefore pretty central to what's politically problematic about a lot of societies in the world today. Not all, but a lot of societies. And there is a sort of sense in which I think it's probably right to say that what's problematic about it is sort of coming to all societies sooner or later now. Unless there's some sort of very drastic process of deglobalization for ecological bellicose reasons. I mean, obviously, some of these processes could be put smartly into reverse, and if they're put smartly enough into reverse, heaven alone knows where you'll end up. So I can't guess about that any better than anyone else. But assuming that doesn't actually happen for a bit anyway, which I think is a fairly sensible assumption, I think that you have to think the politics of most countries in the world today in some respect through the category of democracy, or in a sense over against the category of democracy. It's just sort of part of the primary structuring of what there is to understand. And I thought that I would try and see if I could show people why that was so. And so the last little book that I wrote, I mean, was an attempt to do that. And in some ways, it's a much more offhand-looking book than I meant it to be initially. But in another respect, which I think is important, it's a much more consequential book than I expected it to be initially, because I think what that book shows is that the way in which professional students of politics think the category of democracy today is actually incoherent in a very deep way. That there's something about their sort of basic intellectual equipment which prevents them from thinking clearly about what's supposed to be their central object of study. And since the same sort of potential obstruction is there in a way for practicing politicians potentially, I mean, outside very immediate political contexts, I mean, if their time horizon is more than a few years or two, if it reaches well beyond Harold Wilson's week, I think there's something really important in that book, which sort of bears directly on real political decision making now. And it's I was always convinced in Ghana that it would be a mistake for Ghana to opt deliberately for a political structure which wasn't democratic in the minimal sense of the term, in which a modern sort of representative electoral system is. But I was also very nervously aware that the conflictual potentialities of that sort of structure in a society like Ghana are very high, and it's going to be a continuing practical political challenge for political agents to handle those conflictual possibilities. for the better rather than for the worse. So I've been thinking about those issues in a way, I mean, sort of centrally or very peripherally, ever since. And when I do think about sort of major issues in politics of anywhere, I mean, they tend to come back pretty prominently and quite fast. And I guess I think that it's become rather sort of obviously true in the last 3 or 4 years that this is actually a sort of central hazard space in contemporary human life. I mean, we are all, as it were, acutely vulnerable because of what is problematic in this space and because of the increasingly obvious practical judgment that there's no other alternative space of a safer kind into which we can step and just be secure. So I think there's, I think I've got, pretty accidentally, and certainly not with any sort of, on the basis of any personal discernment, onto a very important trail. And I suppose I now think that the work I've been doing on different aspects of politics over the last sort of 35 years or so has turned out to be important. I didn't do it because I thought it was likely to turn out to be important, and I didn't particularly think it had turned out to be important until well recently, but I now actually think it has turned out to be important. And I suppose I'm sort of going on now from what I perceive to be its importance, rather than from the different sorts of intuitions that have grown on me along the way.
Yeah, well, I put you to 2 hours and over 2 hours of fascinating talk, and we're now on a trail which will take you, if you're anywhere near Jack Goody, for another 20 or 30 years of further production and so on. So this is a midpoint interview, John, but thank you. I think we perhaps ought to let you off now, so thank you very much indeed for that.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. It's been very interesting.